In 2011, Japan was ravaged by a magnitude 9 earthquake, followed by a massive tsunami. In Fukushima Prefecture, TEPCO's Daiichi nuclear reactor exploded and exposed the surrounding area to radiation. Now the radioactive material is seeping into the Pacific Ocean, and it has made the surrounding areas into a post-apocalyptic nightmare. Few people outside of Japan know what happens at Fukushima or how the consequences of this one disaster could potentially affect the whole world. On today's Geographics, we bring you the story of Fukushima. Japan is an island nation located along the volcanic Ring of Fire in the Pacific Basin. Because of where it's located, the country experiences earthquakes and tsunamis on a regular basis. Most towns along the coast have seawalls, and all buildings are equipped to deal with frequent tremors every year. Before 2011, some of the worst earthquakes on record were magnitude 6 or magnitude 7. The Fukushima Prefecture is located in northern Japan. In the 5th century, the people of Fukushima built the Shirakawa Barrier and the Naoto Barrier to protect themselves from the citizens of northern Japan. There were several different ethnic groups in Japan at the time, and the residents of Fukushima felt that their people were more civilized and they wanted to protect pure Japanese blood. Today, that ancient barrier is still standing, and it serves as one of the area's main tourist attractions. Beginning in the 1870s, the Hamadori region of Fukushima became the hub of Japan's coal mining industry. This was the region's main resource for years, aside from farming. The vast majority of Fukushima is filled with forests and farms, and most people lived a simple life generation after generation. After World War II, Fukushima struggled compared to the rest of the country. Western technology made its way into the major cities, and Tokyo wanted to convert to electricity. In the 1950s, TEPCO Energy began creating an electrical grid to power homes instead of using coal. And by the 1970s, TEPCO decided to build nuclear power plants in the town of Okuma, Fukushima. By 1979, both nuclear facilities, called Daiichi No. 1 and Daini No. 2, were both complete. On March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9 earthquake struck northern Japan. It was the worst earthquake that has ever occurred in the entirety of Japanese history, and it is one of the top 5 to ever have occurred in history worldwide. It lasted for 6 minutes, which is far longer than the average quake. It triggered a tsunami traveling at over 400 miles per hour, and it reached heights of 133 feet or 40.5 meters before crashing on the shores at 50 feet or 15 meters high. The tsunami completely destroyed seawalls that were less than 20 feet or 6 meters high and wiped out entire cities in just moments. Normally, these tsunamis only affected the coastline, but this water flooded 6 miles or 9.7 kilometers inland. A total of 18,430 people were killed or went missing throughout Japan. This by itself would have made it one of the greatest natural disasters in history, but what everyone remembers, of course, is the nuclear disaster. The Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO for short, had their nuclear power plants located along the shoreline, which made them vulnerable to a disaster that no one would have anticipated. During the earthquake, lights were crashing and everything went dark. TEPCO employees in the central control room lost all communication with the outside world. Employees had emergency flashlights at their stations, which only slightly illuminated this windowless facility. The employees followed the protocol for an emergency, and they successfully managed to bring all of the active reactors offline at both facilities. But the issue, it was far more complicated than that. Uranium splits apart inside of the reactor, and this releases neutrons. Nuclear fission continues, and every time a neutron blasts off into uranium, it continues to split, and it lets off an immense amount of heat. This uranium is held inside of fuel rods, and when a reactor is shut down, they insert control rods which help to stop the chain reaction. This emergency shutdown process is called SCRAM, and it does come with the big red button that you've seen in movies. However, it becomes so hot that the nuclear reactor has lingering decay heat. It takes up to 24 hours for these nuclear reactors to cool down with the help of a sophisticated cooling system that uses fresh water. But without this cooling system, the nuclear fission, it will continue. Soon after the reactors were shut down, the emergency power generators turned on. The lights were back on, and the cooling system, it began doing its work to bring the temperature down. But unfortunately, that wasn't the end of the story. Even though the emergency backup system worked, they could never have anticipated what would come next. A few minutes later, the shadow of a tsunami appeared on the horizon, and the 50-foot wave towered over the seawall. 2 workers attempting to make repairs in the basement drowned from the floodwaters, and the generators were destroyed. Everything went dark again, and the reactors were no longer cooling the system. The water surrounding the reactor, it was beginning to evaporate. Believe it or not, TEPCO actually had a plan C for situations like this. There was a system called isolation condensers that are supposed to keep the reactor cool even if the backup generators fail and the entire facility loses electricity. But after the flood, that stopped working as well. The employees hoped that the isolation containers were doing their job, but in reality they had no idea since they couldn't access them. The meltdown was already beginning. Just 15 minutes after the tsunami took place, TEPCO contacted the Japanese government and let them know that an unusual event was occurring at the facility. The disaster was beyond anything that the employees had ever been trained to deal with. All of their backups upon backups had been destroyed like a line of falling dominoes. They reached a point where they had no idea what to do next. No one at TEPCO had been trained on what to do in cases of the backup plans failing due to a flood. Cars floated like they were toys in a bathtub, blocking doorways around the facility. Hundreds of aftershock earthquakes continued to happen for the rest of the day. An engineer's job is to find solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Desperate to find a solution, employees began to pop the hoods of all the cars in the parking lot and remove the batteries. They spent the next 6 hours attempting to figure out a way to bring the generators back online using these car batteries. By 9:19 p.m., they had finally managed to collect enough batteries to bring the cooling system back online. The only trouble was that so much time had passed that almost all of the fresh water had evaporated. Without the water, the cooling system, it wouldn't work properly. Now you might at this point be wondering, well, why not just use seawater? I mean, they just got pummeled by tons of the stuff. But corporate executives in Tokyo strictly forbid the use of salt water because it was corrosive to the reactor. It would mean losing a multi-million-dollar facility and never again being able to use it. They were hoping that the issue could be contained long enough for fresh water to arrive. The superintendent of the second plant, Daiichi, ordered 4,000 tons of water from the main office in Tokyo to help cool the reactor, but they delivered 4,000 liters of drinking water instead. Meanwhile, at the other facility, they were far enough from the sea to have power in one of the buildings that had not been flooded. They needed to lay down 5 miles of cables to connect all of the reactors to the power that they had available to keep the reactors cool again. Normally that amount of cable would take a month to lay, but they needed it done in a matter of hours. 200 people were working on it, and some of them even collapsed from exhaustion. 3 days after the tsunami, they successfully managed to finish running the cables and turning the generators back on, and the cooling system began working again. They were lucky enough to be near a freshwater stream, so they took old piping and pumped cold water into the reactor. The employees cheered. Despite all of the odds, they had managed to avoid a nuclear disaster. But the first facility, Daiichi, was not so lucky. Their jerry-rigged generators made from car batteries just wouldn't cut it, and they were far from being out of the woods. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Prime Minister Naoto Kan received the news that the Daiichi nuclear reactor was about to blow. He had to consider the possibility of figuring out how to evacuate 50 million Japanese people in a matter of hours. The disaster had the potential to expose people all the way from Fukushima to Tokyo. He said, "I feared that the entire nation of Japan would be paralyzed by chaos for quite a long time." The employees of TEPCO did not go home. After all, their houses were destroyed by the earthquake and tsunami. With nothing left to go back to, they spent 24 hours at the reactor waiting for the fresh water to arrive. Everyone fully expected to die, but they passed the time trying to monitor the gauges of the water levels in the dark. They held flashlights and used pencils to record the maths to see how much time they had left. However, the gauge was not reading things correctly. They had no idea that all of the water was already evaporated from the cooling tanks and the metal was already beginning to melt. It was already too late. At this point, the reactor was a pressure cooker that was just about ready to blow. The only way to prevent it from exploding was to release steam, which would help to cool down the reactor, but it also meant exposing the surrounding areas to radiation. Prime Minister Kan listened to the options and agreed that releasing steam was the only choice. He announced on Japanese television that the Daiichi plant was in a state of emergency and everyone within a 2-mile or 3-kilometer radius of the Fukushima nuclear reactor must evacuate. Later, it would become obvious that 2 miles wasn't nearly enough and more towns were told to evacuate. On March 12, 2011, Prime Minister Kan was ready at sunrise after a sleepless night. He got on a helicopter and flew to see the nuclear reactor himself. He arrived at 7 a.m. Employees maneuvered their way through the darkness to attempt to open up the valves manually. They were holding the Geiger counters and realized that levels of radiation were much higher than they had ever anticipated. Something had gone wrong. The radiation was so high that they'd not make it out alive. They were forced to abort the mission until they could figure out an alternative solution. Finally, at 2:15 on March the 12th, steam was released. At Daiichi, the uranium from the rods was already melting the surrounding metal encasement. This caused a chemical reaction that created flammable hydrogen gas. The reactor became like a pressure cooker, and it began leaking through the top before finally exploding. Everyone could feel the shock, and citizens from miles away could hear the explosion. Now radiation was pouring out of the reactor without any way to contain it. Employees scrambled to fix the problem, but just when they thought the pressure had stabilized, reactor number 3 exploded at 11:01 a.m. on March the 14th. 50 TEPCO employees were standing very close to the explosion, but by some miracle not a single person was killed, and only 11 people suffered injuries. By March the 15th, it was 4 days after the tsunami, none of the employees had a chance to go home or rest because they were all still working around the clock to prevent another explosion. Over 150,000 residents living in the Fukushima Prefecture had been ordered to evacuate, and the radiation exclusion zone was now a 12-mile radius. For the hundreds of thousands of people who were forced to evacuate, they had nowhere to go. They were kept in the gymnasiums of schools with very little food or water to go around. No one was prepared to help these refugees, especially after so many people had lost their homes after the earthquake and the tsunami. The staff disobeyed orders and began using salt water to cool down the reactor, but they did not have an efficient way to pump it inside. The superintendent quietly gave the order to get buses ready to evacuate the majority of the TEPCO staff, just as reactor number 4 exploded as well. By March the 19th, a fire department equipped with ladders high enough to reach skyscrapers finally arrived to help the employees. They were able to spray water to refill the pools that cooled down the nuclear reactors. Finally, they were safe, and the employees managed to contain the situation. 8 months after the disaster, reporters were finally allowed onto the outer edges of Fukushima to witness the aftermath. They were all forced to wear full bodysuits and carry Geiger counters with them. Even after all of this time, it was still extremely dangerous to enter Fukushima, and it gets much worse the closer that you get to ground zero. Even though this disaster was caused by natural events that were outside of anyone's control, the employees of TEPCO have been shunned by Japanese society, and they are still taking all of the blame for what happened. They have apologized to everyone and taken full responsibility for the event in a very public way. The employees who spent all that time containing the accident now have lethal doses of radiation. One person has already died of cancer, and the rest will surely die years before their time. It is estimated that it could take up to 40 years to clean up the nuclear waste from the Fukushima disaster. Robots equipped with video cameras entered the Daiichi and Daiichi plants in order to ensure the health and safety of humans, but several of the robot missions have failed. The problems with the cleanup are so complex that it requires inventing new technology that doesn't even exist yet. 40 years from now, all of the people who were alive to witness the disaster firsthand will have passed away. People who are not even born yet will be expected to be employed with the sole purpose of cleaning up after the disaster. This cleanup effort involves digging up the radioactive soil, dumping it in plastic trash bags, and then moving the dirt to a remote location. There are now over 9 million radioactive trash bags stacked in what looks like a black and shiny mountain. For years after the disaster, no one was allowed to return to within a 12-mile radius of TEPCO's ground zero. The levels of radiation were so high in certain areas that it would guarantee exposure to deadly amounts of cancer-causing radiation. Houses, cars, and classrooms were left abandoned, with all of the objects still lying there in a time capsule of the moment the disaster took place. Plants are overgrown. Hundreds of wild and aggressive radioactive boars now roam the streets. The Japanese government has given subsidies to the residents who were forced to evacuate so that they could pay for new housing. But for the people who spent multiple generations raising families in Fukushima, they say that money is never enough. It will never replace the beautiful countryside that they knew and that they loved. Japanese citizens are understandably angry at TEPCO and their employees. Even though they prevented an even larger national disaster, there are many who feel that a nuclear power plant should have never been there in the first place. Some people cannot seem to believe that this could have been caused by a natural disaster, and the disaster has inspired several different conspiracy theories. 8 years after the disaster occurred, people are slowly beginning to move back to Fukushima. The town of Naraha, which is 12 miles from the disaster, was the first to reopen, but less than half of the residents have chosen to move back. Over the course of 4 years, the city spent $180 million trying to bring the town back to living conditions. All of the town buildings had to be torn down and replaced by new ones. At a brand new school, there are only 68 children studying there, and the kitchen staff have to check the radioactivity of every single ingredient of locally grown food. While these citizens are doing the best they can to get back to normal life. Only time will tell if their health will be negatively affected by living near Fukushima. There are many citizens who are not content to wait around while the government cleans up, though. One Naraha resident named Hisao Yanai purchased his own digger so that he could aid in the effort of digging radioactive dirt. During an interview with National Geographic, he said that he doesn't mind getting cancer if it means bringing his hometown back to life for future generations. In Japanese culture, there is a deep sense of community and the idea of sacrificing oneself for the greater good. So for many people who have decided to return at their own risk, it's because they want to sacrifice their own lives to help clear up Fukushima. Some are choosing to take care of livestock and household pets that were abandoned after the evacuation. These few people have become caretakers of the radioactive wasteland. Unfortunately, this disaster is not isolated to just Japan. Fukushima was given a score of 7 on the International Nuclear Disaster Event Scale, which is the highest possible ranking. According to Stanford University, the steam from the Daiichi reactor released radionuclides onto the surface of the Pacific Ocean. In just 4 days, a strong jet stream brought this radioactive water all the way to the shores of North America. Studies found that the fish in Japan's water contained a radioactive substance called cesium-137 in amounts that were 150 times the legal limit for consumption, and that the water itself, in a 150,000 square kilometer area around Japan, contains 1,000 times more radiation than it ever has before. The Japanese government is continuing their efforts to clean up the oceans as well as the land. Even though it is clear that the cleanup is far from over, there are those who are eager to move forward. In 2020, the Olympics are coming to Tokyo, and the city is already making efforts to welcome foreigners and make sure they're not afraid of radiation. Signs are now being hung in English all around Tokyo to help foreigners find their way around. It was announced that the torch relay will begin in Fukushima. Many people think that the government encouraging citizens to move back to Fukushima is premature, even if it is only in the towns on the outer edges. Even so, the progress is incredibly slow, and while towns like Naraha have been aggressively trying to return to normalcy, this isn't the case for most places in the 12-mile disaster zone. Now, years after the disaster, people ask themselves if nuclear energy is truly worth having. In recent years, there's been a bit of a push to decommission nuclear power plants around the world. Now, we must ask whether the benefit is truly worth the risk if something goes wrong. What is clear is that we certainly need to be more careful in the future to stop another disaster like this happening again. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Please do subscribe to this channel. It's new. Your subscription really does make a difference. And I'll see you next time.